The alarm system screamed through every corridor of the starship, and Captain Lyria held tight to her command chair as the vessel shook violently, and red emergency lights painted everything in blood colors, and her heart pounded in her chest, but she forced herself to stay calm because her crew needed her to be strong right now. Behind her command seat, the dragon Ember lifted his massive copper-colored head, and his eyes glowed with concern as he felt his bonded partner's fear through their mental connection. And the dragon had been with Lyria for 20 years since she had found his egg on a distant moon and raised him from a hatchling, and now he was larger than a cargo shuttle and fierce enough to fight off entire squadrons of enemy ships. "We have multiple hull breaches," Captain announced Commander Vex from his station, and his silver hair fell across his face as he worked frantically at the controls. "And the meteorite swarm damaged our engines and life support systems and navigation, and we are losing atmosphere in sections 4 through 7. Lyria closed her eyes for just a moment and let herself feel the full weight of their situation, and they were 3 days' journey from the nearest Dominion outpost, and their ship was dying around them, and 12 elves and 4 dragons depended on her to save them. "Seal off the damaged sections," she ordered, and her voice steady despite everything, "and divert all remaining power to life support and engines, and we need to find somewhere to land before this ship tears itself apart." The other 3 dragons in the cargo bay began to roar, and their distress calls echoed through the walls, and Lyria could feel their panic mixing with Ember's emotions and creating a storm of fear in her mind, and she touched the scales on Ember's neck to calm him and whispered soothing words in the ancient elvish tongue. Lieutenant Kira spoke up from the communication station, and her young face pale with worry. "And Captain I'm picking up transmissions from a nearby system, and it appears to be a Class 3 civilization and primitive by our standards. But they have achieved basic spaceflight." Every eye on the bridge turned to Lyria, and they all knew what this meant. And the Dominion had strict laws about contact with primitive species, and interfering with their development was one of the worst crimes an officer could commit, and violators were stripped of their rank and exiled to the furthest reaches of space. But Lyria also knew they had perhaps 2 days of life support remaining, and maybe less if more systems failed, and the nearest Dominion outpost was 3 days away, even at full speed, which they no longer had, and her crew would suffocate long before help arrived. "How far to this primitive system?" she asked, and kept her voice neutral so no one would know how terrified she truly was. 6 hours at our current speed," Kira replied, "and the 3rd planet appears to have a breathable atmosphere and abundant water and vegetation, and it would support our life forms." Lyria made her decision in the space of 3 heartbeats, and she knew it might cost her everything she had worked for, and her career and her reputation, and possibly her freedom, but none of that mattered if her crew died, because she was too afraid to break the rules set course for the 3rd planet she commanded, and prepare for atmospheric entry, and all personnel to emergency stations, and secure the dragons in their crash harnesses. "Commander." Vex looked at her with something like admiration in his ancient eyes, and he had served in the Dominion fleet for 2 centuries, and seen more battles than most elves could imagine. "And Captain, this could mean court-martial," he said quietly. So only she could hear. "I know," Lyria replied, and her jaw set with determination, but I would rather face a court-martial than watch my crew die when we had a chance to save them." The ship limped toward the blue and green planet that grew larger in their viewports with each passing minute, and Lyria ordered everyone to their stations and made sure the dragons were secured properly, and Ember refused to leave her side, so she allowed him to stay on the bridge where his presence brought her comfort. As they entered the atmosphere, the ship began to shake so hard that Lyria's teeth rattled, and smoke poured from damaged panels, and sparks flew from the control stations, and the heat shields were failing, and the hull was beginning to glow red-hot. From the friction, "Hold on," she shouted over the noise, and tried to guide the ship toward what looked like an uninhabited forest region, where they might crash without harming the native population. The trees rushed up to meet them faster than seemed possible, and Lyria pulled back on the controls with all her strength and tried to slow their descent, but the engines were gone, and they were just falling now, and falling toward the ground, like a stone dropped from the sky. Ember wrapped his wings around Lyria's chair to protect her, and the impact when it came was like being hit by a mountain, and the sound was deafening, and Lyria felt her ribs crack from the force of it, and pain exploded through her chest, and darkness swam at the edges of her vision. The ship tore through the forest and trees snapped like twigs beneath them and metal screamed and twisted. And finally they came to rest half buried in the earth and tilted at a dangerous angle. And for a moment, there was only silence, except for the hiss of escaping gases and the groan of stressed metal Lyria. Someone was calling her name and she opened her eyes to find Ember staring at her with worried golden eyes, and his hot breath warming her face, and she realized she had been unconscious for several seconds or maybe minutes. Report. She croaked and every breath sent lightning bolts of pain through her damaged ribs. The crew began calling out their status one by one, and Lieutenant Kira had a broken arm, an engineer. Torin had a concussion and several others had cuts and bruises, but miraculously, everyone had survived and the dragons were shaken, but unharmed. "We need to evacuate the ship," Vex said, and his voice urgent, "and we have fires in multiple sections and the air is becoming toxic." Lyria tried to stand and almost fell, but Ember caught her with his wing and supported her weight, and she gripped his scales and pulled herself upright and ignoring the agony in her chest. "And get everyone out," she ordered, "and take only essential supplies and weapons and medical equipment and emergency rations." They stumbled through the smoke-filled corridors and helped the injured and gathered what supplies they could carry, and the dragons had to squeeze through doorways that were never meant for them, and finally they emerged into the open air of an alien world. The forest around them was burning from the heat of their crash, and the ship was a twisted wreck of metal that bore no resemblance to the proud vessel it had been just hours ago. And Lyria knew without checking that it would never fly again, and they were stranded on this primitive world with no way to contact home and no way to leave. She gathered her crew in a clearing away from the burning wreckage and took stock of their situation, and 12 elves and 4 dragons and enough supplies for perhaps 10 days. And then what? And they had no shelter, and no plan, and no idea if the primitive inhabitants of this world would help them, or kill them. Captain Lyria, a young ensign named Dara, called out, and her voice frightened, and I hear something coming through the trees. Everyone fell silent and listened, and sure enough, there were voices approaching and many voices speaking in a language none of them recognized, and the beams of artificial lights cut through the smoke weapons down. Lyria ordered, and made a decision that surprised even herself, and let us see what these humans are like. And maybe they will help us, and maybe they will not, but we will not start our time on their world with violence. The humans emerged from the trees and stopped dead when they saw the elves and dragons, and for a long moment the two groups simply stared at each other across the clearing, and Lyria held her breath and waited to see if they had crashed on a world of friends or enemies. Then one of the humans stepped forward, and she was a woman with kind eyes and dark skin, and she raised her hands slowly to show she meant no harm, and spoke in that strange language with a tone that sounded gentle and concerned. Lyria's translation device flickered to life at her throat, and processed the human words, and slowly a message formed. "And are you hurt, and do you need help?" Those simple words hit Lyria like a physical blow, and in all her years of service and all the worlds she had visited, and she had never heard of a primitive species responding to an alien crash with kindness instead of fear. And she felt tears sting her eyes, and realized that maybe they had found something rare and precious on this little blue world. "Yes," she replied through her translator, and her voice shaking with emotion and relief and exhaustion. "And yes, we need help." The human woman who had stepped forward introduced herself as Maya Torres, and she spoke slowly and clearly, so the translation device could process her words, and she explained that she was part of something called an emergency response team, and that more help was coming and that everything would be all right. Lyria wanted to believe her, but years of military training made her cautious, and she had seen too many species who spoke kind words while hiding cruel intentions, but there was something in Maya's eyes that seemed genuine and open and honest in a way that made Lyria want to trust her. Maya gestured to the other humans, and they began moving forward carefully, and some of them carried medical supplies, and others had water and blankets, and they approached the elves slowly like one might approach frightened animals, and their body language showed no aggression, only concern. Ember lowered his massive head to study the humans more closely, and his nostrils flared as he took in their scent, and several humans gasped and backed away. But Maya held her ground, and she even reached out her hand toward the dragon. "He is beautiful," Maya said, and her voice filled with wonder and awe. "And can I touch him?" Lyria found herself Nodding before she could think better of it, and Ember allowed the human woman to place her small hand on his copper scales, and he rumbled deep in his chest with pleasure at the contact, and the sound made the other humans relax visibly, within minutes. The clearing was full of activity as the humans worked to help the injured elves, and a man introduced himself as Kyle Bennett, and said he was a doctor, and he asked Lyria's permission before examining her ribs, and his touch was gentle and professional. As he felt the damaged bones, "You have 2 broken ribs," he said through the translator, "and I can wrap them to help with the pain. But you really should not move around too much for the next few weeks while they heal." Lyria almost laughed at that because she was the captain and she could not afford to rest while her crew needed her. But the pain in her chest was so intense that even breathing hurt, and she nodded and let Kyle wrap bandages around her torso. More humans arrived as the sun began to set, and they brought tents and food and more medical supplies, and they worked together to set up a camp around the crash site and posted guards at the perimeter, and Lyria realized the guards were there to keep other humans away and not to keep the elves imprisoned. Lieutenant Kira approached Lyria with her broken arm now in a clean white cast, and, "Captain, the humans have set up a medical tent and treated all our injuries, and they are cooking food for us, and they have asked nothing in return." That concerned Lyria more than almost anything else, because in her experience, no species gave help without expecting something back, and resources were valuable and time was precious, and yet these humans seemed to give both freely. As darkness fell, the humans built fires to provide warmth and light, and Maya sat down next to Lyria and offered her a cup of something hot and sweet, and Lyria sipped it carefully and felt the warmth spread through her body. "Your people have been very kind," Lyria said, and chose her words with care, and in my experience most species respond to strangers with suspicion or violence. Maya smiled and poked at the fire with a stick, and well, we have our share of that too, she admitted, and her voice was honest, and a little sad, but most people are good when given the chance, and you crashed here and needed help, and it's really as simple as that." "Is it truly that simple?" Lyria asked, and could not keep the doubt from her voice. Maya shrugged and looked up at the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky, "And I think we make things more complicated than they need to be sometimes, and you are people who need help, and we are people who can give help, and everything else is just details." Over the next few days, Lyria watched in amazement as humans from all over the region arrived to assist, and scientists came with permission to study the wreckage, but they asked before touching anything, and they respected when the elves said no, and engineers offered ideas for salvaging equipment, and ordinary citizens brought food and clothing and gifts. Children came to see the dragons, and at first the elves were nervous because dragons were predators and powerful and dangerous when threatened, but the dragons seemed to understand that the small humans were younglings, and they were gentle and patient as the children petted their scales and asked endless questions. A little girl named Sophie arrived on the 3rd day, and she could not have been more than 6 or 7 years old, and she walked right up to Ember without any fear and held out a picture she had drawn. "I made this for you," she said, and showed Ember a crayon drawing of a copper-colored dragon flying through clouds. Ember lowered his head and sniffed the paper gently and then rumbled with pleasure, and Sophie giggled and sat down right next to him and began telling him a story from a book she carried, and the massive war dragon who had fought in countless battles listened to the child with complete attention. Lyria felt her throat tighten with emotion as she watched them, and in Dominion space, dragons were weapons and tools and companions to their bonded elves, but they were never treated with this kind of innocent affection by strangers, and Sophie saw Ember not as a weapon but as something wonderful and magical. Commander Vex found Lyria on the 4th day, and his expression was troubled. "And Captain, I have news, and a Dominion scout ship detected our emergency beacon, and they will arrive in 3 days to extract us." Lyria should have felt relieved, but instead she felt a heavy sadness settle in her chest, and she looked around at the humans who had worked so hard to help them, and who had treated them with more kindness than many Dominion officers she had served with. "What will happen to these people when the Dominion arrives?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Vex looked away and could not meet her eyes in standard protocol and memory wipes for everyone who had contact with us and possible relocation if they learned too much. And the Dominion cannot allow primitive species to know about the galactic community. Lyria watched Sophie reading to Ember, and saw Maya organizing volunteers to bring fresh water and saw Kyle checking on the injured elves for the 10th time that day. And she thought about these people having their memories stolen and their kindness erased, as if it had never happened. "That is not right," she said quietly. Vex looked at her sharply. "And Captain, the law is clear. The law was written by people who never met humans like these." Lyria replied, and her voice stronger now as conviction grew inside her. "And these people saved us. And they asked nothing in return, and they deserve better than to have their minds violated." "What are you saying?" Vex asked, and his voice dropping to a whisper. "I am saying we need to tell the truth," Lyria said, and met his eyes steadily. "And we need to report what happened here honestly, and we need to recommend that humanity be evaluated for contact and for membership in the galactic community." Vex stared at her like she had gone mad. "And Captain, that goes against every first contact protocol. And you could be court-martialed and stripped of your rank and exiled." "I know," Lyria said, and felt strangely calm about it, but I cannot leave here and pretend these people do not matter, and pretend their kindness means nothing. And if speaking the truth cost me my career, then so be it." That night, Lyria called her crew together and laid out the situation and explained her plan, and told them they could choose to support her or not, and that she would understand if they wanted to follow standard protocol to protect their careers. Every single member of her crew voted to support her, and even the ones who had served in the Dominion fleet for decades. And Lieutenant Kira stood up and said, "These humans treated my broken arm with more care than Dominion doctors have ever shown, and I will stand with you." Captain Engineer Torin nodded and added, "They gave us food and shelter when they could have turned us away or killed us. And that kind of compassion is rare in the galaxy, and it should be recognized." When Maya found Lyria later that evening and asked if everything was all right, Lyria told her the truth and explained that a ship was coming to take them home, and that Dominion law required them to erase the memories of everyone who had seen them. Maya was quiet for a long moment, and then she said, "Will you fight that I am going to try?" Lyria said, "Good." Maya replied and smiled at her, "And because I think the universe is better when people remember kindness." The Dominion scout ship arrived exactly when Commander Vex predicted, and it descended from the sky like a silver blade, cutting through clouds, and landed in the clearing with the kind of precision that came from centuries of advanced technology. And Lyria stood waiting with her crew behind her and her spine straight, despite the pain in her healing ribs. Captain Andros emerged from the ship, and he was an old elf with white hair and cold eyes who had served the Dominion for 300 years, and he looked at the gathered humans with obvious disgust, and then turned his attention to Lyria. "Captain Lyria," he said, and his voice was formal and sharp, "and I am here to extract you and your crew and begin cleanup protocols for this incident cleanup." Protocols meant erasing the memories of every human who had seen them, and possibly relocating the entire town if too many people knew. And Lyria felt anger burn hot in her chest, but she kept her voice level and calm. "Captain Andros, I need to speak with you privately before any protocols begin, and I have prepared a full report on the incident." Andros looked annoyed but nodded, and followed Lyria into one of the tents the humans had set up, and away from the watching eyes of both species. And once they were alone, Lyria handed him a datapad containing her detailed account of everything that had happened. Andros read in silence, and his expression growing darker with each passing moment. And when he finished, he looked at Lyria like she had committed treason. "You want me to recommend first contact protocols for a primitive species," he said, and his voice was dangerously quiet. "And you want the Dominion Council to evaluate humans for membership in the galactic community. And have you lost your mind, Captain? I have gained clarity," Lyria replied, and met his angry gaze without flinching. "And these humans saved our lives, and they did so with compassion and generosity. And they asked nothing in return, and that kind of character is exactly what the galactic community claims to value." "They are primitive," Andros snapped, "and they barely have spaceflight, and their technology is centuries behind ours, and they have wars and poverty and disease." "So did we once," Lyria said, "and so did every species in the Dominion at some point in their history, and advancement is not just about technology, Captain, and it is about how a species treats those who are different and those who are vulnerable, and by that measure humans are more advanced than many species I have served with." Andros threw the datapad down on the table. "And this is not your decision to make. and you violated first contact protocols, and you endangered the timeline of this species' development, and you will be court-martialed. For this, I know, Lyria said quietly, and I am prepared to face whatever consequences come, but I will not be silent about what I witnessed here, and my entire crew supports my report, and they have all filed statements. You have poisoned your crew, against their duty. Andros said with disgust, I have shown them what true honor looks like. Lyria replied, and her voice steady, and we took an oath to serve the greater good of the galaxy, and sometimes that means challenging laws that no longer serve that good. Before Andros could respond, there was a commotion outside and raised voices in both Elvish and the human language, and Lyria rushed out of the tent with Andros following, and found Dominion security officers trying to set up memory wiping equipment, while Maya and other humans stood in their way. You will stand aside, Maya said, and her voice was firm. And these are our people and our memories, and you have no right to take them from us. The security officers looked uncertain, because they were trained to handle hostile aliens, not peaceful civilians who simply refused to move, and one of them raised a weapon. And Ember roared so loud that the ground shook, and the other 3 dragons joined him, and suddenly the security officers were facing 4 angry dragons who were protecting the humans. Stand down, Lyria commanded, and walked between the security officers and the humans, and her voice carried the authority of someone who had commanded ships for decades. And there will be no memory wipes today. Captain Andros was furious, and you are relieved of command effective immediately, and you are under arrest for violation of first contact protocols. Fine, Lyria said, and held out her wrists for restraints, but my crew and the dragons stay here until the Dominion Council reviews my report, and I will not have you traumatize these people while hiding behind protocols. The standoff might have turned violent if not for Sophie, who walked right through the tension carrying a bundle of papers, and the little girl went straight to Andros and held up drawings she had made. I drew pictures of all the dragons, she said with a bright smile. And see, this one is Ember, and this one is Shadowfang, and this one is Starlight, and this one is Frost, and they are my friends. Andros looked down at the child, and something in his cold expression flickered, and he took the drawings with hands that were not quite steady, and studied the crayon images of dragons flying through stars. Your friends, he repeated, and his voice was softer than before. Sophie nodded enthusiastically, and they tell the best stories, and Ember lets me sit with him every day, and Captain Lyria says they might teach me to ride when I am older if I am very good. Andros looked from the child to the dragons to the gathered humans who stood united against his security team, and then back to Lyria, and she could see him thinking and calculating and maybe even doubting. How long have you been here? He asked. 6 days, Lyria replied, and in 6 days you believe you have learned enough about this species to recommend contact in. 6 days. I have learned more about compassion and generosity than I learned in 50 years of service, Lyria said, and these people are good, Captain Andros, and they deserve a chance. Andros was silent for a long moment, and then he said, I will forward your report to the council, along with my own observations, and you and your crew will remain under house arrest here until they make a decision. And if they reject your recommendation, you will face full court-martial. Lyria nodded, and that is acceptable. The security officers were ordered to stand down, and the memory-wiping equipment was packed away, and Andros returned to his ship. But he left a small team to monitor the situation, and Lyria was technically a prisoner, but the Dominion officers seemed uncertain about how to guard her when she was surrounded by helpful humans and protective dragons. Maya found Lyria that evening sitting by the fire, and thank you, she said simply, and for standing up for us. You stood up for us first, Lyria replied, and it was only right to return the favor. Over the next weeks, while they waited for the council's decision, Lyria watched human and elf relationships deepen, and the children continued to visit the dragons daily, and the scientists from both species began sharing knowledge carefully, and the engineers worked together to salvage what they could from the wreckage Kyle. The doctor spent hours teaching Elvish medical techniques to human doctors and learning about human medicine in return, and he was amazed by how much they could learn from each other. Despite the technology, Gap Commander Vex became friends with a human named Lisa Chang, who ran a local school, and they discussed education and philosophy. and found they had similar ideas about teaching young people to think critically and treat others with respect. Lieutenant Kira taught human children basic mathematics that would not be discovered on Earth for another century, but she did it through games and puzzles, so it seemed like play, and the children loved her. The Dominion monitoring team tried to remain professional and distant, but Lyria noticed them accepting food from humans and helping with repairs around the camp and even smiling at the children who brought them flowers and drawings. Sophie appointed herself as the official dragon ambassador, and she made schedules for when different people could visit and drew name tags for each dragon and organized storytime sessions where humans would read to the dragons who listened with apparent interest. One evening Andros returned and he looked tired and older somehow, and he asked to speak with Lyria privately. Again, and this time his tone was not angry but weary. "The council has reviewed your report," he said, "and they are sending a full diplomatic team to evaluate the situation, and this has never happened before. Captain, and you have created a situation that has no precedent in Dominion history. Is that good or bad, Lyria?" Asked Andros smiled slightly, "And it is complicated, and there are council members who want you executed for treason, and there are others who are calling you a visionary, and the debate has been intense." "And what do you think?" Lyria asked, and genuinely curious. "I think," Andros said slowly, "and that little girl gave me drawings of dragons, and I have been in service for 300 years, and no one has ever given me a gift, just because they wanted to," and he pulled out Sophie's drawings, which he had apparently kept, "and I think maybe you are right, and maybe these humans are special." The Dominion diplomatic team arrived 3 weeks after Andros' first visit, and they came in a massive ship that carried not just diplomats, but also scientists and cultural experts and military observers, and even a few council members who wanted to see this unprecedented situation for themselves. Ambassador Theron led the delegation, and he was ancient even by Elvish standards and had witnessed the inclusion of dozens of species into the galactic community over his long life. And he stepped off the ship and looked around at the camp where humans and elves worked together, and his expression was unreadable. "Captain Lyria," he said formally, "and I am here to conduct a full evaluation of this species and determine if your recommendation has merit and you will cooperate fully with our investigation." "Of course," Ambassador Lyria replied and stood at attention, despite the lingering pain in her ribs, "and my crew and I are at your disposal." Theron nodded and then said something that surprised everyone. "And I would also like to meet the humans who helped you and hear their perspective on what happened." Maya stepped forward without hesitation. "And I am Maya Torres, and I was the first to make contact, and I can answer any questions you have over." The following days, the diplomatic team conducted extensive interviews with both humans and elves, and they observed the interactions between the species and studied human culture and technology and social structures, and they seemed particularly interested in how humans had responded to the crashed ship. Ambassador Theron spent a full afternoon with Sophie, who explained very seriously about her friendship with Ember, and showed him all her drawings and told him stories about the dragons. And Lyria watched the ancient diplomat listening to the child with an attention that suggested he was learning more from her than from any official report. The cultural experts interviewed Maya and Kyle and Lisa and dozens of other humans, and they asked about human values and beliefs and how their society functioned and what they hoped for their future, and the experts seemed surprised by the answers they received. One evening, Ambassador Theron invited Lyria to walk with him through the forest, away from the camp, and they walked in silence for a while before he spoke. "I have evaluated over 40 species for inclusion in the galactic community," he said, and his voice thoughtful. "And I have seen advanced civilizations with incredible technology, and peaceful societies with sophisticated philosophy and warrior cultures with strict honor codes." He paused and looked up at the stars beginning to appear through the trees. "And I have never seen anything quite like what I have witnessed here. Is that good or bad?" Lyria asked, and echoed the question she had asked Andros. Theron smiled slightly, "And it is unprecedented. And these humans have technology that is primitive by our standards, and they have social problems and conflicts and imperfections, and by every traditional measure they are not ready for contact." Lyria's heart sank. "And so you will reject my recommendation?" Theron held up a hand and let me finish. "And what these humans also have is something we have not seen in the galaxy for a very long time, and they have genuine compassion for strangers, and they helped you not because of what they could gain, but because it was the right thing to do, and that quality is far more rare than advanced technology. So what does that mean, Lyria? Asked and hardly dared to hope. It means, Theron said, and that I am recommending immediate contact protocols and not the standard observation period, but full diplomatic relations, and humanity will be invited to send ambassadors to the Dominion and begin the process of integration into the galactic community. Lyria felt tears spring to her eyes, and truly Theron confirmed. But there are conditions, and humanity must choose this path freely, and they must understand what they are agreeing to, and the galaxy is not always a kind place, Captain, and there are species that will see humans as weak because of their compassion, and there are dangers we cannot fully prepare them for. I think humans are stronger than they appear, Lyria said, and they have survived wars and plagues and disasters, and they are still capable of kindness. Theron nodded, and I believe you are right. But they deserve to make this choice with full knowledge of what it means. The next day, Ambassador Theron called for a meeting with human leaders and representatives from the local government and military and scientific community, gathered in a tent that had been set up specifically for diplomatic functions, and Lyria stood to the side with her crew and watched as history was made. People of Earth Theron began and spoke through translators so everyone could understand. And I am Ambassador Theron of the Galactic Dominion, and I am here to offer your world something that has never been offered. To a species at your level of development. He paused and let that sink in. And we are offering immediate diplomatic contact, and we are inviting humanity to join the galactic community as a recognized species with full rights and protections. The humans looked stunned, and Maya spoke first. And why, and what did we do to deserve this? You saved the lives of people who were strangers to you, Theron replied, and you did so without hesitation, and without asking what you would gain, and that kind of compassion is the foundation of a truly advanced civilization. But our technology is so far behind yours, one of the human scientists protested, and we barely understand the physics of your ships. Technology can be learned, Theron said, and character cannot, and we have seen species with incredible technology use it for conquest and cruelty. And we have seen species with primitive tools build societies of remarkable kindness. And humanity has shown us something precious. There was a long silence as the humans absorbed this, and then Maya asked, and what are the conditions? Theron explained carefully, and you must choose this freely as a species, and not just as individuals. And you must understand that joining the galactic community means following its laws, and contributing to its defense, and accepting that you are part of something larger than just Earth. He continued, and there will be challenges, and there are species in the galaxy who may see you as weak or naive, and there are dangers we face together, and you will need to be strong and unified. The human leaders asked questions for hours, and they wanted to know about the other species and the structure of the Dominion, and the laws they would need to follow, and the benefits and risks of membership, and Theron answered every question with patience and honesty. Finally, the leader of the local government stood and said, we cannot make this decision alone, and this affects all of humanity, and we need time to discuss with our world leaders and explain to our people what this means. Of course, Theron said, and take the time you need, and this is not a decision to be made lightly. Over the next month, human leaders from around the world came to the crash site and met with the diplomatic team and saw the friendship between humans and elves, and watched children playing with dragons, and discussed what joining the galactic community would mean for their species. Lyria watched the debates unfold and saw humans arguing passionately on both sides, and some feared the changes that contact would bring and worried about losing their independence, and others were excited by the possibilities and eager to learn from advanced species. Sophie asked Lyria one day if the humans said no, would she and Ember have to leave, and Lyria knelt down to the child's level and explained as gently as she could, if humans choose not to join the galactic community, then yes, we would have to leave, and those are the rules. But whatever happens, I will never forget your kindness. Sophie hugged her tightly, and I do not want you to go, and you are my friend. You are my friend too, Lyria said, and felt her heart break a little at the thought of leaving. Finally, after weeks of discussion and debate, the human Leaders reached a decision and they called for another meeting, and representatives from every nation on Earth attended either in person or through communication devices, and the tension in the tent was thick enough to cut Ambassador Theron. The Human Secretary General spoke, and we have discussed your offer extensively, and we have considered the risks and the benefits, and we have listened to our people. She paused and looked around at the gathered humans and elves, and humanity chooses to accept your invitation, and we wish to join the galactic community, and we understand the responsibilities that come with this choice, and we are ready to face them together. The tent erupted in cheers from both humans and elves, and Sophie jumped up and down with excitement and ran to hug Ember, who rumbled with pleasure. And Ambassador Theron smiled, and for the first time Lyria saw genuine joy in his ancient eyes. Then on behalf of the Galactic Dominion he said formally, "And I welcome humanity to the stars." 6 months passed after humanity accepted the invitation to join the galactic community, and those months brought changes that transformed not just Earth but the entire Dominion, and Lyria stood in what had once been the crash site, but was now the location of Earth's first embassy to the stars, and watched as construction crews, both human and alien, worked together to build something beautiful. The charges against her had been dropped, and not only that, but she had been promoted and given a new title, and she was now the first official Dominion ambassador to Earth, and a position that had been created specifically for her, and her crew had all received commendations and medals for their actions. But the real reward was getting to stay on Earth and watch as two species learned from each other and grew together. Maya found her watching the construction and stood beside her in comfortable silence for a moment before speaking. And hard to believe, it has only been 6 months and it feels like everything has changed. Everything has changed. Lyria agreed and smiled at her friend, and in the Dominion there is already talk of the human effect, and species that have been isolated for centuries are suddenly interested in cooperation, and your compassion is spreading. Maya laughed, and we are not saints, and you know that, and we still have wars and poverty and all our old problems. I know, Lyria said. But you also have hope. And that is something the galaxy had forgotten, and you reminded us that kindness is not weakness, and that helping strangers is not foolish, and that technology without compassion is worthless. Sophie came running up with Ember walking slowly behind her, and the dragon had grown even larger in the past months, and the little girl had appointed herself as Lyria's unofficial assistant, and she took her duties very seriously. Ambassador Lyria, Sophie said importantly, and using the title she loved to say, "And you have a meeting with the Earth Council in 1 hour, and they want to discuss the student exchange program." "Thank you, Sophie," Lyria replied equally seriously. "And I will be ready." "And how is Ember today?" "He is sad," Sophie said, and frowned, "and I think he misses flying, and can we take him to the new flight range that the engineers built?" Lyria looked at Ember, who gazed back at her with those intelligent golden eyes, and felt through their bond that Sophie was right, and he had been grounded since the crash, and his wings were healed, but he had not flown in months. "Tomorrow," Lyria promised, "and we will fly together, and just the two of us like old times." Ember's rumble of pleasure made Sophie giggle, and she ran off to tell the other children about the flight plan she was already making. The meeting with the Earth Council went well, and they discussed the student exchange program that would send 100 human students to Dominion worlds and bring 100 alien students to Earth, and it was ambitious and risky and exactly the kind of thing humans excelled at. One of the council members brought up concerns about the cultural differences, and what if the students cannot adapt, and what if there are conflicts? Then they will learn. Lyria said simply, "And conflict is not always bad, and it is how we handle conflict that matters. And these students will learn to navigate differences and communicate across cultures and find common ground. And those are the skills the galaxy needs most right now." Another council member asked about Lyria's plans for the embassy and what programs she wanted to implement, and Lyria had been thinking about this for weeks. "I want to create an exchange program not just for students but for families," she said, "and I want human families to host alien visitors and alien families to host humans, and I want children to grow up knowing that the universe is full of different kinds of people, and that different does not mean dangerous." The council approved her proposal unanimously, and over the next months the embassy became a hub of activity, and humans came to learn about other species and aliens. came to learn about humanity, and the children who had first met the dragons became junior ambassadors who helped newcomers feel welcome. Kyle, the doctor, started a medical exchange program, and human doctors learned alien healing techniques and taught their own methods in return. And he discovered that humans had a unique approach to medicine that emphasized emotional support alongside physical treatment, and other species were fascinated by this holistic approach. Lisa Chang, the teacher, developed a curriculum that taught human children about the galaxy and alien children about Earth, and she found that children of all species learned faster when they learned together, and that friendship transcended language barriers. Commander Vex, who had been offered a promotion back to the Dominion fleet, chose instead to stay on Earth and help Lyria build the embassy, and he said he was too old to go back to the rigid military life after experiencing human warmth and spontaneity. The dragons became ambassadors in their own right, and Ember and his companions traveled to schools and hospitals and community centers, and everywhere they went, they reminded people, both human and alien, that building bridges between species was possible. 1 year after the crash, Lyria stood on the flight range with Ember and prepared to give a speech at the dedication ceremony for the new embassy building, and thousands of people, both human and alien, had gathered to celebrate. She looked out at the crowd and saw Maya standing with her family, and Kyle with a group of doctors he was training, and Lisa with her students, and Sophie in the front row holding a new drawing, and Ambassador Theron, who had traveled from the Dominion capital specifically for this event. "My friends," Lyria began, and her voice amplified so everyone could hear, "and 1 year ago, my ship crashed in the forest behind us, and I was terrified and injured and certain that we would be met with fear or violence. Instead," she continued, "and we found kindness, and we found people who helped strangers without asking what they would gain, and we found a species that valued compassion as much as progress." She paused and looked at the dragons who stood behind her, and their scales gleaming in the sunlight. "And what happened here changed the galaxy. And humanity showed us that advancement is not just about technology or power, and it is about how we treat each other, and especially how we treat those who are different from us. There are people in the Dominion who say humans are naive," Lyria said, and her voice stronger now, "and they say your compassion will fade when you face the harsh realities of the galaxy, and they say you are not ready for the dangers that exist among the stars. But I have served in the Dominion fleet for 50 years, and I have seen those harsh realities, and I have faced those dangers, and I believe that humanity's compassion is not a weakness but a strength, and perhaps the greatest strength any species can have." The crowd was silent and listening intently, and because compassion does not mean being weak, and it means being strong, enough to help others and brave enough to trust strangers and wise enough to know that we are all better when we work together. Lyria smiled and looked directly at Sophie. "And today we dedicate this embassy to the idea that kindness can change the universe, and that a crashed ship and a helping hand and a little girl's drawings of dragons can transform the galaxy." She raised her hand, and Ember roared, and the other dragons joined him, and the sound echoed across the valley, and humans and aliens cheered together. After the ceremony, Sophie ran up to Lyria and gave her the drawing she had been holding, and it showed a copper dragon flying through stars with an elf on his back, and below them a blue and green planet where humans waved. "This is you and Ember," Sophie explained, "and you are going to visit all the planets and teach everyone to be friends." Lyria knelt down and hugged the child, "And maybe we will, and would you like to come with us someday?" Sophie nodded enthusiastically. "And I want to see everything, and I want to meet all the different kinds of people, and I want to tell them about Earth." "You will," Lyria promised, "and when you are older, you will make a wonderful ambassador." That night, Lyria and Ember finally flew together, and just the two of them soaring through the night sky above Earth, and the dragon was joy itself, and his powerful wings carried them higher and higher until the lights of cities looked like stars. Through their bond, Lyria felt Ember's contentment and his happiness at being whole again and flying free, and she realized that she felt the same way, and the crash had broken their ship, but it had also freed them from old ways of thinking and opened up possibilities they had never imagined. Below them, Earth turned slowly, and above them the stars shone bright, and Lyria thought about how one moment of disaster had led to this, and to friendship between species, and hope for the galaxy, and a future where compassion was valued as much as strength. She thought about the Dominion and how it was changing because of human influence, and species that had barely spoken to each other for centuries were now cooperating on projects and sharing resources, and the Council was debating new laws that emphasized kindness alongside justice. She thought about humanity and how they were preparing to venture into the galaxy, not as conquerors but as friends, and how their children would grow up knowing that the universe was vast and full of wonders. Most of all, she thought about the simple truth that had emerged from all of this, and that sometimes the most important moments in history happen not through grand plans or mighty weapons, but through simple acts of kindness between strangers who chose to help rather than to harm. Ember roared his agreement, and the sound carried across the night sky, and Lyria laughed with pure joy, and together they flew toward the stars.